I'd like to introduce to you Beth Brickell. Ms. Brickell had a career in Hollywood as an actress and then graduated from the American Film Institute in Los Angeles with an MFA in directing. After writing and directing 2 award-winning dramas for television in the 1980s, her agent asked what she wanted to do next. Beth told him the little she knew about the disappearance of Maud Crawford, a mystery in Camden that happened in 1957 when she was attending the University of Arkansas in Fayetteville. He said, "That would make a good movie. Write a screenplay about it." She returned to Camden, her hometown, to ask questions about the case and learned in the first week that the case had never been properly investigated and that people were frightened to talk about it. Having a newspaper background, she spent the next 16 months investigating the case. She wrote an 18-article investigative series about her sensational findings that the then Arkansas Gazette printed on its front page over 5 months in 1986. Since then, Beth has continued to uncover what happened to Maud Crawford and has published 4 books about the fascinating case, which are The Disappearance of Maud Crawford, In Their Own Voice, Interviews from the Maud Crawford Investigation, Most Credible Conclusions from Maud Crawford Interviews, and Solving the Maud Crawford Puzzle. The books are available on Amazon and Beth's website, which is luminousfilms.net. She has recently completed a screenplay, What Happened to Maud Crawford, and hopes to get a movie produced about the mystery.
Thank you, Melissa.
Thank you.
Well, she's told you everything you need to know, but I'll tell you a little more. Thank you for driving to Washington and finding us way out here. I'd like to tell you a story. There are 4 main characters to this story. The first one is Maud Crawford. Maud was the first woman attorney in Camden. She graduated valedictorian of her class in Warren, her high school class. She spent a year at the university in Fayetteville, and then she became the secretary to a lawyer in a very prestigious law firm in Camden. The lawyer became a judge. He was so impressed with how much Maud learned about law as his secretary that he encouraged her to take the bar exam. This is 1927, when women were only allowed to become a lawyer for 10 years. She took the bar exam with the graduating class at the University Law School, and she made the highest grade. In 1921, oil was discovered in South Arkansas. Maud quickly became the go-to expert on clearing land titles, which determined who got the royalties from the oil. It was said that Standard Oil of New Jersey wouldn't drill a well in South Arkansas unless Maud Crawford's name was on the title. She just didn't make a mistake. She was married to Clyde Crawford. Clyde had served on the front lines in World War I. When he got back home, he had a nervous breakdown. He couldn't hold a job. It was said that Maud took care of him like a baby after this. They turned their outdoor garage into a workshop for Mike, for Clyde, and he finished floors and furniture for people in Camden. Maud was a very generous person. She and Clyde had no children. A cousin of hers died, and Maud took in the cousin's youngest 2 daughters and raised them through high school. Maud was also very civic-minded. She was the first woman elected to the city council in Camden. She served for 8 years. She was president of all 3 women's civic clubs. She headed up charity drives in Camden. And Girls State, that's Clyde, and some of you already know, Maud had a vicious guard dog, a Dalmatian she called Dal. This dog would not let anyone come near Maud, even Clyde. But here she is, Arkansas Girls State. 2 years after Boys State was established, Maud thought it was just as important for girls to know how government works as for boys. So she and one of the civic clubs that she was so active in petitioned the governor to establish a girls' state. And she served as a counselor at Arkansas Girls State every summer from 1943, when it was established, until her last summer, which was 1956. In 1955, y'all come in. In 1955, Camden was given an award as the most improved city in the state. And it was Maud they asked to go to Little Rock and receive the award from the State Chamber of Commerce and the Arkansas Business Council, because she had more to do with Camden winning it than anybody. The second lead character in our story is Mike Berg, a peculiar man. He had a germ phobia. He wore gloves all the time. If you were introduced to him, he'd put his hands behind his back because he didn't want to shake your hand. He would wait at doors for other people to open them for him. His mother took him out of school in the 8th grade. Other kids were teasing him. So he wasn't an intelligent man, but people said he was shrewd. He was married to Helen Berg, who was very loved, very respected in the community, a very different type of person than her husband. And they had 3 children. Mike's father was Leo Berg. He was also very respected in the community of Camden. He was elected mayor in the 1920s. He died of a heart attack early in the 1930s. He had a brother in Camden, Henry Berg, and they formed a partnership that they called the Berg Brothers Estate, and they made quite a lot of money in the 1920s. Clyde gave $50,000 to Orville Faubus for his first campaign for governor, with the understanding that if he got elected, and he did, that he would appoint Mike a state police commissioner, one of 7 over all policing in the state. Mike was notorious for, he considered himself above the law, and he was notorious for burning down rental houses or buildings or anything that he felt didn't make enough profit for him so that he could collect the insurance. people in Camden referred to some of his employees as his henchmen. They said he had someone to burn for him, someone to steal for him, and someone to kill for him. The third main character in our story is Mike's aunt, Henry's widow, Rose Berg. Rose lived across the street from Maud. Maud was her best friend and her personal lawyer. She was also Henry's personal lawyer. And in 1949, before Henry died in 1950, they asked Maud to draw their wills. Henry had made a lot more money than Leo. During the Depression, he acquired land in 5 states for buying up people's property who couldn't afford to pay their property taxes, and by foreclosing on loans that he made to people. So Maud drew up their wills, and they had decided they didn't have children. They decided they would divide their wealth 4 ways. When Henry died, Mike inherited 1/4 of all of his assets. And when Rose would die, the $30 million that she inherited from Henry, which in today's money is well over $300 million, so it was a lot of money. And that money was supposed to go to her 3 nieces on her side of the family who had grown up in Camden but had since married and moved out of state by the 1950s. The 4th main character in our story is Thomas Goen. Thomas was head of Maud's law firm, and also he was Mike's personal lawyer. He told his wife that his main job was keeping Mike out of prison. Mike didn't pay bills, so Thomas would get him to deed over timberland to him. And perhaps his widow, Louise, told me that Thomas would rather have the timberland than money anyway. And maybe his desire for timberland from Mike would explain why he became one of Mike's most important enablers to help him with crimes and stealing, as you're going to hear, because this is a story. Mike found out about Rose Berg's will, leaving everything to her 3 nieces. And he made up his mind he was going to get all of those assets before Rose died. The first thing he did was he had Thomas draw up a 9-page gift deed which gave Mike all of Rose Berg's Berg brothers' assets. Now, none of this belonged to Leo, but they were still called the Berg brothers' estate. The first 8 pages, and I've seen it, were itemized, single-spaced, all of those assets. And Mike had his accountant get Rose, who trusted her. His accountant was her accountant, had been Henry's accountant for years, so she trusted him and would sign anything that he put in front of her. So the accountant had Rose sign the last page of this gift deed without showing her the first 8 pages. Well, when this gift deed was recorded in the courthouse and Maud found out about it. Of course, she saw it for the theft it was, and she was outraged. She couldn't take legal action because Mike was a client of her firm. She called two of the nieces who lived in California to come to Camden to challenge this deed because most of their inheritance had just been given away to Mike. $25 million worth of their inheritance. Rose still had a $5 million personal estate. So the nieces came from California. They used a lawyer in El Dorado. They went before the probate judge in Ouachita County. The problem with that was Mike Berg was the primary campaign contributor for the judge. The judge declared, they had Rose on the stand saying that she never saw the first 8 pages. She didn't know what she was signing when George asked her to sign that last page. But the judge declared the deed legal. Then the question was, who would be appointed the business guardian to take care of all of Mrs. Berg's financial affairs, since there was a conflict of interest with the accountant being both Mike's accountant and Rose's accountant. The nieces wanted a bank in Little Rock as a neutral party to be the guardian appointed for her business and financial affairs. But Thomas Goin talked the judge into appointing a local man. His name was Ed Pace. The problem with that was Ed Pace was also Mike's real estate agent and insurance agent, a flagrant conflict of interest, but the judge let that stand. Before the nieces went back to California, Maud urged them to have Mrs. Berg declared incompetent so she couldn't sign anything else over to Mike. By the 1950s, Mrs. Berg was considered what they called senile. They said she had her good days and her bad days. So they went back before the probate judge. He declared Mrs. Berg incompetent. So the next thing they did was Mike and one of his so-called henchmen, Jack Doris was his name, burned down one of Mrs. Berg's apartment houses. It was empty at the time. It was on the gift deed. But Mike wanted the insurance payment, and Maud let everyone know that by law, Rose was supposed to receive all of the income from all of those Berg brothers' assets before she died, until she died. But Mike got Ed Pace and intimidated him into signing over, endorsing over the insurance check to him. Next, a sawmill in Prescott wanted to buy the timber off of 1,600 acres of timberland that Mrs. Berg owned up here in Hempstead County. And it was on her personal estate. So how was Mike going to get this money without it being too obvious, because Maud was on his case? So he had his accountant draw up 2 deeds, dated the same day. The first deed gave the 1,600 acres of timberland from Rose to the timberman. He was called Hugh Mosley. And the second deed then transferred it all over to Mike. Well, Mike made a promise to his accountant and Hugh Mosley that if they pulled off this scheme, he would divide the profit from the timber 3 ways. The timber sold for $90,000, but Mike reneged on what he would give the timberman, Hugh Mosley. He would only give him $12,000. And Hugh Mosley was very upset about this. He had signed the 2 deeds, which made the whole scheme happen. He had overseen the cutting of 1,600 acres of timber, so that they couldn't be cheated at all by the sawmill. And he knew Maud Crawford, and he went to Maud as a lawyer, wanting her to get the other $18,000 that he felt Mike still owed him. And that's how Maud found out about this fraud. Well, Maud was 65 years old at the time. She told Thomas Goin, this was 1957, she told Thomas that she was willing to take early retirement in order to bring criminal charges against Mike in Little Rock because of the timber fraud. And she had acquired significant evidence about this case. And Thomas told Mike that in his opinion, Maud had enough evidence to put him in prison. So Mike went to Maud and tried to bribe her with money. And she showed him to the door instead. Maud was a very honest person. She taught Sunday school at the Methodist Church. So at this point, Mike and Jack started planning her abduction and murder. As I said, this was 1957. 2 years before this, Clyde had been in an accident, and they said some stranger ran into the Goin law firm, told Maud, Clyde's been in an accident, come on, I'll take you to the hospital. She dropped everything immediately and went with this man. She didn't even know the man. He didn't take her purse with her. That's how upset she was. So Mike decided that would be the ploy he would use to get Maud out of the house without having to deal with that vicious guard dog. So on March the 2nd, 1957, Maud was home alone. This was a Saturday night. It was pouring down rain. People told me the fog was so thick, it was like pea soup. Clyde had gone to a movie downtown. There were 4 working girls who rented rooms, bedrooms upstairs in the Crawford house. They were from out of town, and they had all gone home for the weekend. So Maud was home alone. Mike and Jack came up the Crawford driveway in a 1937 Cadillac LaSalle that had belonged to Rose Berg. Mike had kept it in storage with some other old cars. Mike told Maud, Clyde's been in a terrible accident. I saw the ambulance. Come on, I'll take you to the hospital and bring you home. Maud was already worried about Clyde going out in the bad weather, and she didn't drive at night, so she went with him. But they didn't take her to the hospital. They turned right on Washington Street. Jack slit her throat with a knife. 2 employees of Mike saw blood on the back seat upholstery of the LaSalle the next morning before the car disappeared, never to be seen again. And they drove on out Washington Street past the city limits to a property where Mike was building a lake for Helen to fish in. A couple of feet from the water's edge was a dry well. They dropped Maud's body in this well. And the same night, Mike woke up one of his other so-called henchmen, a man named Lee Wilson. Lee was manager of his construction company. He told Lee, go wake up Harry Parr, a black man, and tell Harry to go dump cement in that dry well out at on the lake property. And Harry did drop cement in that well the very night. And Mike told Lee, see if you can do something to the dam that will make the water rise faster. The water was still rising to fill the lake. See if you can make it happen faster so that the water will cover over that well. And that's what happened. Well, Clyde got home that night around 11 o'clock, and Maud wasn't there. He watched TV a little bit, and then he got very worried that she hadn't come home. So he thought maybe she was sitting up with a sick friend. So he got in his truck. He drove past friends' homes, but everything was dark. He stopped two patrolmen. He asked if there'd been an accident that might explain why Maud wasn't home. Then at 2 a.m., he went to the police station and reported Maud Crawford missing. Well, the next morning, it spread like wildfire that Maud Crawford had disappeared, one of their community leaders. It was actually international news because Senator John McClellan had been a partner in the Goen law firm before he was elected to the Senate in 1942. And at the time of the disappearance, he was chairman of a Senate committee investigating alleged mob ties to organized labor. It was the #1 news story throughout the world at that time. So the first thought was, maybe the mafia had kidnapped Maud Crawford, Senator McClellan's former associate, in order to intimidate him into backing off of his investigation. No ransom note appeared, so that theory was dropped. They couldn't find a body, but what they did find, the local police, was evidence that their local state police commissioner had abducted and murdered Maud Crawford. So they declared the case at a dead end after 4 days. And the state police abandoned the case after 2 weeks for the same reason. No further investigation took place for 28 years. I grew up in Camden, and Melissa's already told you a lot of this, but I was living in Los Angeles and by the mid-1980s. I had finished film school, had become a director. I had directed a couple of TV movies. And my agent asked me what I wanted to do next. And I told him the little bit I knew about the Maud Crawford mystery. He said, well, that would make a good movie. Write a screenplay about it. I went back to Camden to ask questions. And I learned within the first week the case had never been properly investigated. And people were frightened to even talk about it. I had a newspaper background. So I spent the next 16 months investigating the case. At a certain point, I started writing newspaper articles about my findings that the then Arkansas Gazette printed on its front page over a 5-month period while I continued my investigation. I wrote 18 articles in all, and they caused quite a sensation in the state. In recent years, so many people have tracked me down on the internet asking how they could read those articles in the Gazette that I published them as a book, The Disappearance of Maud Crawford. Then I started thinking maybe people would like to read the interviews and draw their own conclusions about the case. I had recorded all of them, transcribed them, typed them up. So I brought out a second book in their own voice. I didn't change a word. Interviews from the Maud Crawford investigation. Then I learned some new facts about the case. I brought out a third book, Most Credible Conclusions from the Maud Crawford Interviews. And when I learned what they did with her body, I brought out my last book, Solving the Maud Crawford Puzzle. So, that's my story. And if you have any questions, I'm told we have a little bit of time if you want to ask them. Do you all have any questions?
My question is, did they find her body in the well with the cement on it? Does that make sense?
The property is still Berg family owned, and they won't let us excavate the well. I sent my last book to children of the Berg. My son had 3 children. And I sent my book, Solving the Maud Crawford Puzzle, and asked them to excavate the will to their oldest son. His name is Mickey Berg. Interestingly, Mickey Berg has all the money in the world because he has all of Rose Berg's money. He lives in Danny, I'm looking at Danny because Danny and another friend, we sneaked onto the property after they drained the lake, the Berg Lake. And when I was doing my investigation, an accountant for Mike took me on the property at that time when the lake was still full and took me and showed me where the well is located under the water. The water was murky that day and I couldn't see the well, but I talked to a guy in Oregon who said he fished in that well when he was 10 years old. They let him play on the property. When Woodford and Bernstein did their investigation of Watergate, I had read their book, All the President's Men, and they had a rule that they never reported anything unless they had 2 witnesses, 2 different sources, independent of one from the other. So I took that for a rule for myself. And because this accountant had taken me to the property, but that was only one source, I never reported that in my early 18 articles. But in recent years, I got called by the son of Harry Parr, who dropped the cement in the well that night. And he talked about how his mother always said, "That's where that lady's buried," because they woke her up that night too. And she told the family that Harry didn't come back home until early that Sunday morning because he was pouring concrete in that well, and that his mother had always said, "That's where that lady's buried. She's in that well out at the lake." That family, the Parr family, had lived in a rental house on that property before it became a lake, and they got their water from that well. So Harry Parr knew exactly which well to go to that night, and so did the wife know which well he had dropped concrete in. Anyway, that's why I now have two sources, because Wendell Parr, the oldest son of Harry Parr, told me about what his mother said all the time. I asked him, would she even say that in front of Harry? And he said, yes, but that's one subject my dad would never talk about. Does that answer your question? Yes.
Is that Maud Crawford Memorial Site at Taste Bluff? Is that her memorial site? Is it at Taste Bluff where she's buried, her tombstone and stuff at Taste Bluff?
No, she doesn't have a tombstone. They have her remains.
Well, they have. There's a
cemetery in Camden. Clyde is buried, and there's a blank spot waiting for Maud's remains next to his gravestone. But
at Taste Bluff, there's a big square fenced-in piece of property, and it has a big tombstone on it, and it has her name.
really, I don't know about that.
You don't?
Tate's Bluff.
It's outside of Camden.
Oh, I'm going to go to Camden.
It's when the Missouri River and the Ouachita River come together.
Do you know where that is, Danny?
I know where it is, but I've never heard of that either.
Why don't we go look at that tomorrow? I'm going to go to.
If you turn in and go into Taste, I heard some stories about this from the people that live there. I'm from Colorado, so I don't know nothing. But anyway, these people that I fished with, they've been in Camden and are in this area. But as you go down into Taste Bluff, there's a little smooth area, and on the left is this big fenced-in thing, and it's got a big rock tombstone with Maud Crawford.
Let's look into that tomorrow.
It sounds like something Bill Bacon probably came up with. Because his family's from that area.
Did I talk loud enough for you? Did you hear everything I said? Okay, good. Any more questions?
Do you have any books here?
Did I have any?
Books here?
I brought a sample of each book that I'm donating to the archives out on the front table, if you all are interested in looking at them. And the books sell on Amazon and my personal website called luminousfilms.net. If you're interested in ordering them, they sell for $20 and $25. And I get all of the Amazon orders so that I can autograph the books. And I'm going back to Camp Los Angeles on Monday, so I can mail them to you next week if you're interested. Yes?
Has anyone picked up the screenplay?
I have the screenplay. And I do have a company interested.
I mean, has someone picked it up to produce a movie?
Well, we're working on it, let's put it that way. So it's very difficult in Hollywood, but we're working on it. So you'll be the first to know. What else? Anything else? Oh, yes, sir.
Did Mike Berg live very long after this happened?
1975. 10 years before I went back to Camden to investigate the case, or no one would have talked to me at all. That's why they were so frightened about the case, because of his reputation and what he would do to anybody who he considered an enemy. Anybody else? I appreciate so much you all coming. She does have a question.
If y'all have questions, please raise your hand high.
Did you have threats made to you?
Yeah, people in Camden kept saying, you're going to end up like Maud Crawford. You're going to end up in the Washita River. I can't tell you how many times they told me this. And I did have my life threatened twice by children of one of the other so-called henchmen who people thought had actually killed Maud. And I did a lot of interviewing of him. He was very open with me, and he didn't know a thing about it. And I got him to take a lie detector test because so many people were so sure. His name was Lyle Dews. So many people were sure that he was the one who had killed Maud. But he passed the lie detector test except for one question. Have you ever told anyone and bragged about killing Maud Crawford? And he had done so. Over the years, he had told people that he had killed Maud Crawford. That's why they thought he killed her. But he didn't know a thing about it. So we declared him innocent during my investigation, my series. Yeah.
I'm from Mount Holly. I know that family, and there's a nickname for him, Lyle Dews. Sorry.
Lion Lyle.
Yeah, I grew up around him.
I don't know if did you know Lyle yourself?
Yes.
Oh, he was an interesting character. I must say, I interviewed him.
Nicest man you ever met. You think gold grew from his fingertips, but I wouldn't have trusted no further than I can.
Oh, you can't trust him, but he was one of the most humorous people I've ever met. He was the funniest guy. He had me laughing, and I'm interviewing this guy, and he's making so many funny cracks.
To give a little family history, his sister, Margie, is my great aunt.
Oh, yeah? Well,
And so I heard a lot of stories growing up.
his two daughters are the one that threatened my life.
Yes.
The older daughter.
One lives in Mount Holly still.
The older daughter said to me, I've got to raise these kids. I was at her house. And I'm going to make sure I can raise them. And you better not do anything that, anyway, they both were scary.
They're still scary.
They were so scary, and I'd heard so many bad stories about them that when I would go interview those two sisters, I would leave a message in my typewriter where I had gone in case I never came back. Anyway, thank you all for being so interested and so attentive. It's a real compliment, not just to me, but to Maud Crawford. And that's what's important to me. Thank you very much.
I would like to introduce to you David Sesser, who is the director of Sims Memorial Library at Southeastern Louisiana University. An alumnus of Henderson State University, he holds graduate degrees in public history and higher education from the University of Arkansas at Little Rock and library and information science from the University of Southern Mississippi. With research focused on both Civil War Arkansas and the history of higher education in the state, he is the author of The Little Rock Arsenal Crisis, On the Precipice of the American Civil War, which came out in 2013, and The School with a Heart, Henderson State University at 125, which came out in 2015. He resides in Hammond, Louisiana with his wife Deb and their son Ethan. Dr. Sesser.
Well, thank you, Melissa, for that wonderful introduction. I was telling one of my friends in Little Rock that I was going to be, back in the state presenting, and he shared the Charles Portis quote with me. You can never quite reach escape velocity to get away from Arkansas. It's always sucking you back in. So I spent 20 years in Arkansas, and I loved every moment of it. And hopefully, after my sojourn to Louisiana, we can get back to the promised land up here. But today, I'm going to be talking about Old Mike, the mysterious man of Prescott. And I'm sure some of you in here have some personal experiences with Mike, and I would love to hear about those as we go through this presentation. I learned about Mike in 2008. I became the curator at the Nevada County Depot and Museum in Prescott, and I worked there for not quite 2 years, but one of the first professional presentations I ever did was about Mike at the Arkansas Historical Association, where they wanted things about quirky aspects of Arkansas history. This is about as quirky as you can get. Just as a note, there are images in this presentation of a dead body, Mike. So just be forewarned. So just a little bit about Prescott, of course. Everyone knows where it is, just up the interstate a little ways from us. Prescott exists simply because of the Cairo and Fulton Railroad, laid down in 1874. Before Prescott, a little to the east, was the village of Moscow. And there was a Civil War battle there in 1864. A little to the west, which kind of extends into modern day Prescott, was the Battle of Prairie du Chien, immediately preceding the Battle of Moscow. So there were people there, but Prescott itself dates to 1874. Of course, the railroad continues to go through there today. The museum, which I highly encourage you to visit if you've never been there, is in the train depot. And so if you've never been up and close, personal with the train as it's going full blast through a small town, you will experience it in that building. So people started moving there immediately because it was, a good place to live, a good place where you could stake a claim, get a farm, open a small business. And as you can see, the population grew quite quickly. In 1910, there were a little over 2,700 people living in the town. So this is just an early 20th century shot of Prescott, nice big brick buildings. The ladies over on the far side in their very fancy clothes. Prescott really doesn't look too much like this today, but that's what it looked like over 100 years ago. So let's talk a little bit about the background of Mike. What happened, what we know. So in August of 1911, the Presbyterian Church in Prescott decided that they were going to have their services outside. It was just too hot to be in that building. So they actually had 3 services that Sunday. They had an early morning service, they had an 11 o'clock service, and then they had an evening service that began at 8:15. It was in the city park there in Prescott, which is still there, still a city park. And the next morning, around 8 o'clock, the body of a man was found under a tree in the park. Nothing too suspicious about it at that time. He was under a tree. It looked like he had, perhaps fallen asleep, died in his sleep. Nothing too worrisome. So they took the body to the local funeral home, which I'm sure many of you know, back in the day, the hardware store was also the funeral home, Prescott Hardware Company. And the local coroner was Dr. W.W. Rice. He called in a group of men to serve as the coroner's jury to determine why this man had passed away. And so they did their investigation, which we would call very cursory, but there were no markings on the body, nothing to indicate foul play at all, which is really what they were worried about. If they could determine that this person had not been murdered, then they could easily move on. And so they ruled that the person died of heart failure, either heart attack, stroke, something like that. There was some evidence that supported that, and we'll get to that. So this was on Monday, August 21st, 1911. And this is actually the Prescott Daily News from that day. It was an afternoon paper. And you can see on this side right here, unidentified man found dead in park. And they go in detail explaining what they know at this time. So he was found at about 8 o'clock. The paper comes out in the afternoon around 3 or 4. So this is a really quick turnaround, trying to get the word out to the local population. There are 2 newspapers that were consistently published in Prescott at this time. This is the daily paper, and then there was a weekly paper that came out on Fridays, the Nevada County Picayune. So what we know from the Prescott Daily News: the man was handicapped. He used 2 crutches to get around town. Now, this is not only from what the coroner's jury observed, but it's also what people who knew this man observed about him. It's about 5'4", which is a pretty common height for men at that time in the early 1900s. Brown eyes, brown hair, and of course, he's like many of us with a bald patch at the top. Brown mustache. Interestingly, he did have a tattoo on this part of his right arm. It's a woman on a pedestal. That's important later on. And his left leg was a bit shorter than the right with a stiff ankle. So that makes them think that maybe he had a stroke earlier in his life, and then he had a second final fatal stroke. And he had 2 gold teeth, which is not very common at this time. It's not unheard of. So those were the physical descriptions. This is what the body had on it. So less than $2 of change, chewing tobacco, 2 handkerchiefs, about a dozen lead pencils. So the pencils are important because of this man's job. People knew him because he would come to Prescott regularly selling pencils and other small items like that, buttons, threads, pens, things like that. So the first article came out the day the body was found. This article came out on Friday with additional details. So these are all the same details that appear in the first article, but there's a bit more information. So the gold teeth, they're more specific about the locations in the person's mouth. 1 upper tooth was gold, an unspecified number in the lower jaw. Had a slight scar on his left arm, opposite the tattoo on the right arm. And they estimated that he was about 45 years of age. None of those items were in the original article. And then, of course, they listed the clothing and other items that were found with him. So they knew that the coat he had on was made by a business in Texarkana because they could read Texarkana on the label, but they could not read the tailor's name. Silver teaspoon. They were very specific that he had 80 cents of money. Remember, the original article said less than $2, which that's correct, but it's not as specific as it could be. And so then these are details that have come in over the years from other sources, people who knew him. Weighed about 120 pounds. So about 5'4" and 120 pounds. Think about how thin he was. Very thin. He would carry kind of a canvas and leather bag with him, and that's what he had his pencils and other items in. So every few weeks, he would come down the railroad, he would stop in Prescott, and he would get off on the afternoon train. If you've been to Prescott, you know the railroad tracks run straight through the middle of town. So he would work one side of the tracks, and then he would move to the other side of the tracks, going in neighborhoods on both sides. He would stay at O'Halloran's Hotel, which faced the tracks. He would get up the next morning, he would sell some more stuff, and he would get on the next southbound passenger train, and he would go to Hope. And so these are examples of some of the things he sold: pencils, shoestrings, combs. Now, the Nevada County Picking Union reported that he was 45. How did they come to that conclusion? Because other people have said that he was anywhere between 40 and 60. That's a big age gap. Very big age gap. This is very important. He was Italian, and of course, Italian at this time was kind of a broad, so Southern European descent or Eastern European descent. And this is also important later on. We'll talk about that. So, who was this man? You notice I keep saying this man, this man, this man. We have no idea who he was. He did have a name assigned to him, Mike. So I think it's funny that Beth talked about a guy named Mike a lot, and now I'm talking about another Mike, two totally different Mikes. So what they did was they took the body to the local funeral home, Cornish Funeral Home, which, you know, Cornish Funeral Homes still exist in Prescott today. And they embalmed it, shared the word, as you saw in those newspaper articles. Hopefully, the family would see those articles, read the details in the articles, make the connection, and come to Prescott to claim the body. At the coroner's jury, there was an itinerant umbrella repairman who testified, which I had no idea that was a job. But he reported that he saw the deceased along with another guy in Little Rock, where they had both been arrested for public drunkenness, and as their punishment, they were banished from the city of Little Rock. And that was about 10 days before this, so around August the 1st, 1911. Other witnesses reported seeing him in Arkadelphia and Girton, which makes sense if he was on the train and he was coming down the line towards Prescott. So, this is Mike. Remember, Undertaker Cornish had embalmed him. So he was dressed in a suit, which is not what he was wearing when he died. And they embalmed him. We'll just, at this point, we'll just say embalmed him. So he died on the night of August 10th, August 11th. August 26th, the first follow-up article appears in the Prescott Daily News saying they don't know where his family is. They still don't know what his name is. They're going to continue. And it says the remains will be kept for, quote, several weeks longer. Well, Undertaker Cornish was very proud of his skill, especially with embalming this particular body. And he did it in such a way where he really embalmed the body. He used all of his expertise and preserved it in a way that he had never done with any others. So this is a closer look of Mike. This is quite a long time after he had passed away. Okay. So, as you can see, the body, even though it is embalmed, is deteriorating over time. We don't know what date any of these photos were taken. So they're all unknown dates. But you can kind of track some of them by what's in the background. Okay, so why did no one come forward and identify him? Why did his family never come to Prescott to claim the body? Well, as you saw in those two initial articles, they're not sharing the exact same information. There is some overlap, but if a family reads one article and not both, they might not make the connection. Many people in Prescott, Arkadelphia, Garden knew him. No one knew his name. He was a person that they would see regularly. They would interact with him. They would buy things from him. But no one bothered to ever learn his real name. So, as I said, the solution to this problem is Cornish embalmed it as much as he possibly could. They put the body on display. Sometimes, the body was moved around, as you can see from some of the photos. That first photo of the body's obviously outside, leaned up against a wall. The photo that's a close-up of the face, I'm assuming that was an interior photo. They would take photos regularly. They would put a clean suit on the body about once a year, and they would take care of the body. And eventually, it became an advertisement for the funeral home. And we know that because we have this image of him next to the brand new Cornish funeral home hearse. This is probably in the early 1920s. And he's just propped up next to the car. And you can kind of tell if you look very closely at this picture and some of the others, he's in a suit. This is a different suit. So they were changing the clothing. So who was Mike? And we're going to call him Mike because that's the name that was given to him. Well, as I mentioned earlier, there was a witness at the coroner's jury that said, I saw him arrested with another guy in Little Rock about 10 days ago in city court, and they were banished from Little Rock. So apparently he made his way to Prescott. We know the names of the two guys that were arrested. The traveling salesman said that the deceased man shared that he had a brother in Chicago. So we have a Chicago connection at this point. Looking at the Arkansas Gazette, which this is once again the second reference we've had to it in two presentations, two guys, Pat McFarland and J.M. Estes. Now remember, the guy is of Eastern European or Southern European descent, so Italian. He's not an Irishman named Pat McFarland. We know that. So we're going based on the idea that he is J.M. Estes. Of course, J.M. Estes could be a completely fictitious name. We have to take that into consideration. So let's look at the Estes family in Chicago in 1900 and 1910. And we found one guy. His name is Morris Estes, and his job is the same thing as Mike's job, a peddler. He goes around selling things. We know Morris had at least 4 siblings, 1 brother and 3 sisters. Morris was from Russia. He immigrated to the United States in 1883. He married in 1884. And he died in Chicago in 1939. And now this is an important thing of where we might be able to make a little bit of progress in identifying Mike. We know that Morris and his family were all Jewish. So if we had someone who saw Mike and was able to know that part of the body, that might be the first step into knowing if this is the right track we're on. Now, on the other hand, you remember, what did he have here on his arm? He had a tattoo. Observant Jewish people typically don't have tattoos. So that's a strike against this theory. So, Mike over the decades, and I love hearing stories about Mike at the funeral home. They moved him to the back room, behind a curtain. I've heard door. He obviously was moved around as well. Had a chain pull light. You'd open the door, pull the light, and there he is looking at you. So, of course, young people from all around would go and see Mike. They changed the suits regularly. And you remember the close-up of the face. Well, over time, the eyes shrank back into the head. They sewed the eyelids shut, and they very crudely painted eyes on. And then also over time, even though the body wasn't necessarily deteriorating much, the skin darkened. And so that caused some confusion. The very first time I ever gave a presentation, and I had images of Mike, a guy in the back stood up and said he was obviously African American. And I had about 5 people in the audience who stood up and said, we saw him as kids. He was not African American. He was obviously of Southern or Eastern European descent. It's just his skin darkened over time. So why can't you see Mike anymore at Cornish Funeral Home? It's because thankfully he has been buried. In 1975, Arkansas had a new attorney general. Anybody know who that was? A little guy named Jim Guy Tucker. He helped lead the legislature in actually codifying a lot of laws. You know, Arkansas had all kinds of laws, but they weren't really organized that well. And a new law was abuse of a corpse. And then this is the actual law here. And what they were doing to Mike falls under B, where you can't not only physically mistreat a corpse in a manner offensive to a person or reasonable sensibilities. I would strongly argue that's what was happening to Mike in the funeral home. And that was a Class D felony. And so this is actually published in the Acts of the Arkansas General Assembly in 1975. So this is the burial of Mike. You know, Jerry Westmoreland, Methodist circuit preacher in Hempstead and Nevada counties, he was the one who was asked to lead the service. That's him with the Bible at the service. That was everyone who was at the service. It was not publicized at all because they didn't want people upset and protesting and saying that we shouldn't be doing this. It wasn't done in the middle of the night, as you can see, but it was definitely done without any publicity. And then these are Mike's headstones. So the smaller one is the original one. It really just has the 1911, and then of course the one above it. We don't know his birth date, obviously, but we do know his death date and his burial date. So, who was Mike? Will we ever know who he was? You know, one way that today with the technology we have that we didn't have in 1975, of course, DNA testing. But it would take exhuming the body, and hopefully they would be able to obtain enough material, you know, because it was embalmed well over a century ago. It has deteriorated over time. So that would be a pretty big stretch. But, you know, with all the advances in technology that are going on today, you know, they're finding serial killers and things based on familial DNA. That is an option. But the question is, who would pay for that? Who do you think Mike was? Any theories? That's the end of my presentation. I'm more than welcome to take any questions, listen to any experiences you've had with Mike. If you saw, you know, Danny already told me that he saw Mike as a child. He took his nieces to see Mike when they were children. Apparently it was a thing. Danny did ask me if I saw Mike. I was born 8 years after he was buried, so I didn't have that opportunity. But I have been to his grave, and it's something that I've always thought about. And you know, it's kind of one of those things where, you know, we can now probably find out the answer, but should we? That's a question. So, any questions? So the Attorney General actually reached out to the coroner's funeral home and sent them a letter saying, this is the law, it's been codified now, you should probably bury Mike. At that time, there are reports that there were 2 other similarly preserved bodies in Arkansas that were buried, not in southwest Arkansas. There have been multiple reports that consistently say 2 bodies. Have never been able to figure out where they were. Any details at all. So that is kind of a long-term project because Jim Guy Tucker's papers are now in Little Rock at the Butler Center. So it would be a big slog to find out where those other bodies were, but it would be good to know that as well. Anything else? If you ever saw Mike, raise your hand. 1, 2, okay, good. I mean, it was an experience, and that's kind of interesting. There was nothing to do in Hope, so you went to Prescott.
Well, yeah, that was
Yeah. Good.
Well, it's just so amazing the changing times, how no one thought anything of that when she was growing up.
Right.
And we recently were talking about it at a Thanksgiving thing, and there's the teenagers in our family now that are growing up didn't believe us.
Yeah.
Very much
No way.
Y'all are making this up. We said Google it.
Yeah.
And they did, and they were just flabbergasted
Yeah.
that was allowed to happen.
Right. Yeah, and that's the thing is, it started with such good intentions. You know, let's get him to his family. And, you know, I have the feeling, you know, I never lived in Prescott. I lived in Arkadelphia for 20 years and commuted. But he became really a symbol of the community and kind of like almost a mascot. And, you know, they could proudly say, we're from Prescott, that's where Mike's from, you know. But yeah, it is a story. I practiced this in Louisiana with some of my faculty and staff, and none of them believed me for a long time. And I'm like, this is totally for real. I have pictures and things, and I have been to his grave.
It is unreal now to think about it being fact, but I did experience it.
Yeah. And I always give the people in Louisiana grief. I'm like, you live in Louisiana. This is a third world country. So anyway, but well, thank you so much for coming. I really want to thank Melissa and all the staff from Sarah and the Arkansas State Archives for putting this on. It gave me a great reason to come back, like I said, to the Promised Land. And thank you so much for coming today.